Washington, D.C. used to shine as a center of jobs and growth, attracting people from all over. Now, rising prices and government struggles have turned this once blooming city into an economic mess. In this video, we'll reveal the explanation behind the broken economy of Washington, D.C. and its aftermath. Washington, D.C. isn't just the capital of the United States, it's one of the most unique cities in the world, both politically and economically. Unlike any other place in the US, DC isn't a state or a regular city, which gives it a very different setup. Even with this unusual structure, Washington, D.C. has one of the most productive local economies on the planet, with a GDP per person higher than Monaco's. But this wealth comes with a catch. The city also has some of the worst economic inequality in the world, meaning the gap between the rich and the poor is huge. So what's behind D.C.'s economic power? A big part of it is the city's role as the headquarters of the US government. The federal government is a massive source of money and jobs for the city. Key agencies like the FBI, ATF, and EPA are based here, which brings in a constant stream of resources. These agencies attract industries, lobbyists, and even foreign governments, all wanting to have a say in US policies. Because of this, many big companies like IBM, Amtrak, and Marriott have set up their headquarters in DC too, adding to the city's financial strength by staying close to political power. DC is also known for its high-paying jobs, especially in tech, research and development, R&D, and defense. In 2018 alone, DC received $4.64 billion in federal R&D money, much of which went to fields like medicine, energy, and defense projects. These are the types of industries that keep the city's economy humming. Plus, tourism plays a huge role in DC's economic health. Iconic landmarks like the Smithsonian Museums, the Lincoln Memorial, and the US Capitol bring in millions of visitors each year, and those visitors spend a lot of money in the city. Government data tells us much about how Washington, D.C.'s economy stacks up compared to other states. Believe it or not, if D.C. were a state, its economy would rank 34th in size among all states. That's pretty impressive for a city that isn't technically a state yet. The Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Bureau of Labor Statistics provide information on the city's economic growth, job market, and overall economy, helping us understand just how powerful DC is. As of October 2023, the unemployment rate in DC was 5%. Now let's talk about research and development, or R&D, in the US. In the fiscal year 2023, the US government spent about $190 billion on R&D, one of the biggest jumps in spending in recent history, with a 13% increase over the previous year. Why the sudden increase? The US faces rising competition from other countries. New laws like the CHIPS and Science Act and the National Quantum Initiative Act are meant to keep the country ahead in the race for technological innovation. These laws focus on areas like computer chips and quantum science, which are crucial for the future of the US economy. However, despite the government's significant spending, the private sector is now the main driver of R&D in the US. While the government once accounted for nearly 70% of global R&D spending in the 50s and 60s, private companies make up 73% of R&D spending. Over the past several decades, this shift has happened as private companies have become innovation leaders, especially in computing, biotechnology, and defense technologies. Take venture capital, for example. In 2023, private venture capital investment in advanced computing and software was around 450% of what the US Department of Defense, DoD, invested in those areas. In biotechnology, private sector investment was even higher, about 800% more than the DoD spending. In other words, private companies are now outpacing the government in many key areas of innovation. Moreover, the private sector's involvement isn't just about spending more money, it's also about being faster and more flexible. Over the past few years, the private sector has developed strategies to make their R&D efforts more impactful. Silicon Valley, for instance, has popularized ideas like disruption and having a startup mindset, and these concepts are slowly making their way into government R&D. Even though public and private R&D have different goals, they share a common need. Both need to speed up the process of turning research into real-world results that matter, whether in the short term or long term. We all knew government R&D in the US has a history of rising to the occasion during times of crisis, delivering breakthrough technologies on fast timelines. The question is how to keep that same energy going during more stable times. By learning from top R&D organizations in fields like pharmaceuticals, aerospace, and venture capital, US federal agencies could adopt some of the best practices to get more out of their R&D budgets and keep pushing the envelope regarding innovation. These strategies could help the US government, and maybe even governments in other countries, continue leading the way in technological breakthroughs for years. Washington, D.C. might seem like one of the richest places in the world if you look at its GDP per capita. It's higher than any US state and even wealthier nations like Monaco. But this number only tells part of the story. DC's economy works in a way that makes its GDP per capita look much bigger than it is. Why? Well, many people who work in DC don't live there. Instead, they commute from neighboring areas like Maryland and Virginia. These commuters contribute to the city's economy but aren't included in the official population count. When you divide the city's massive economic output by a relatively small official population, the result is a GDP per capita that seems almost unreal. A quirky example of this is the area around the National Mall. This part of the city generates billions of dollars every year, but it technically only has 2 official residents: President Joe Biden and the First Lady Jill Biden. This odd fact shows how misleading GDP per capita can be as a way to measure how wealthy a place is. Even though Washington, D.C. looks wealthy on paper, the reality is much more complicated. The city has some of the richest, most powerful people in the world, but it's also home to many people who struggle with poverty. D.C. has some of the worst income inequality in the country. Looking at life expectancy and household income, the gap between the richest and the poorest is shocking. Many of the people who are hit hardest by poverty are from minority groups, especially Black and Latinx communities. One of the reasons for this inequality is that DC isn't a state. This means the city has a different political and economic control level than a state. For example, Congress can overrule local laws and has the power to control parts of DC's budget. This makes it hard for local leaders to make the necessary changes to help the city's most vulnerable residents. There have been plenty of proposals to give DC more control or even make it a state, but these ideas have faced strong opposition from national politicians. Washington, D.C.'s economy is a puzzle. It's one of the wealthiest areas in the world, thanks in part to its sky-high GDP per capita. But at the same time, economic inequality is deeply entrenched. The city's role as the political leader of the US brings in a lot of wealth and influence, but it also limits DC's ability to govern itself and address the needs of all of its residents. Regarding the numbers, DC's real GDP in the third quarter of 2023 was $179.2 billion, with a growth rate of 2.4% per year. But here's the kicker: DC's economic growth is slower than the rest of the US. That's another layer to this paradox. The city's economy is enormous. Still, it's not growing as quickly as other areas, and the benefits of that economy aren't reaching everyone equally. To understand the challenges DC faces, looking at the unemployment data is helpful. In November 2023, DC had the second highest unemployment rate at 5%. What's even more concerning is that this rate is much worse for certain groups, particularly workers of color. Black and Latinx residents face far higher rates of unemployment compared to their white counterparts, partly because many of the jobs available in DC require higher levels of education, something not everyone in the community has access to. This lack of opportunity isn't just about jobs, it's about wealth too. The racial wealth gap in DC is enormous. The median income for Black households in the city is about $38,000, less than a third of the median income for white households, around $126,000. The numbers for Latinx families are slightly better but still far behind, with a median income of $65,000. Wards 7 and 8, where most of DC's Black residents live, have the lowest incomes and face some of the toughest economic challenges. Additionally, these economic inequalities didn't happen overnight. They result from decades, if not centuries, of discriminatory policies. Historic practices like redlining, where people of color were denied the opportunity to buy homes in certain neighborhoods, and predatory lending have prevented Black and Latinx families from building wealth in the same way that white families have. This wealth gap is not just about income, it's about assets like savings, home ownership, and investments. A study by the Urban Institute found that the median wealth for white families in the DC area was $284,000, while the median wealth for Black families was just $3,500. That's a massive difference. Even education, often seen as a great equalizer, hasn't been enough to close this gap. Black heads of households with a college degree still have a negative median net worth, while white households with the same level of education report a net worth of $258,000. This shows that the racial wealth divide is deeply rooted and can't be solved by education alone. One of the most obvious signs of inequality in DC is home ownership. In the DC area, home ownership rates for people of color are far below those for white residents. About 64% of white households own their homes, compared to just 31% of Latino households, 35% of black households, and 40% of Asian households. This is partly due to gentrification and displacement, which have made it increasingly difficult for communities of color to stay in the neighborhoods they've lived in for generations. Furthermore, the COVID-19 pandemic only made things worse. Many businesses, especially those owned by people of color, were hit hard, and a lot of them didn't survive. This has led to a rise in housing insecurity and homelessness, particularly among low-income residents and people of color. Despite all these challenges, efforts are underway to address the racial wealth divide in DC. One initiative, the Building High-Impact Nonprofits of Color DMV project, is focused on supporting nonprofits led by people of color that aim to boost economic mobility and help build wealth in marginalized communities. This project and others like it create opportunities for residents of color to save, buy homes, and secure better-paying jobs. Another effort is Prosperity Now's DMV Racial Wealth Divide Profile, highlighting the key data trends showing how deep these economic disparities run in the DC region. These reports are being used to spark conversations across sectors, nonprofits, businesses, and policymakers about creating long-term, meaningful change. Washington, D.C.'s economic paradox isn't going to be solved overnight. However, understanding the problem is the first step toward addressing it. The city's wealth is undeniable, but so are its deep inequalities. To truly build a more equitable future, DC must find ways to support its most vulnerable residents, address the historic policies that created these disparities, and push for more autonomy to govern itself and make decisions that benefit all its people. With continued efforts, like those led by local nonprofits and advocacy groups, DC can start to close the gap between its wealthiest and its poorest residents. Only then will the city's impressive GDP per capita start to reflect a more accurate picture of prosperity for everyone, not just a select few. Washington, D.C.'s economy reflects the broader trends across the United States, showcasing impressive strengths and significant weaknesses. On the surface, it may look like a successful and wealthy area boasting high productivity. However, for many residents, the reality is quite different. The city struggles with serious inequality and structural problems that affect people's daily lives. Despite the outward appearance of success, the deep-rooted issues need urgent attention, and addressing them may require political changes to give DC more power and representation. One aspect of this complexity is seen in the overall economy of the US. In August 2024, the monthly trade deficit decreased, dropping from $78.9 billion in July to $70.4 billion. This change happened because exports went up while imports went down. Specifically, the deficit in goods fell by $8.4 billion to $94.9 billion, and the surplus in services slightly increased to $24.4 billion. Looking at international services, in 2023, the US exported $1,026.6 billion worth of services and imported $748.2 billion. In 2022, the most recent data available, US multinational companies supplied $2,114.1 billion in services to foreign customers through their overseas branches. Meanwhile, services provided to US customers by foreign companies were $1,517.8 billion. Most of the services exchanged between countries happen through these affiliates. The US current account deficit, which measures the balance of trade in goods, services, and income with other countries, widened by $25.8 billion to $266.8 billion in the second quarter of 2024. This increase indicates a growing problem with trade in goods, now making up 3.7% of the country's gross domestic product, up from 3.4% in the first quarter. Breaking it down further, US exports of goods saw a slight drop to $516.7 billion, while imports rose by $20.1 billion to $813.9 billion. In terms of services, exports increased by $3.1 billion to $271.7 billion, and imports grew by $2.9 billion to $197.7 billion. Overall, the net transactions in the financial account showed a negative figure of $304.3 billion, indicating that the US borrows more from foreign countries than it is lending. These numbers highlight the ongoing struggles of Washington, D.C.'s economy, marked by deep inequalities that reflect a broader national trend. To build a better future, the city must tackle these challenges head-on. What do you think are the key steps needed to bridge the economic divide in Washington, D.C.? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.